Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Mariana 5 from Razor Edge, and I'm here with Fallout 86, and we're going to review a hand that you played a while back at a 1-2 live cash game. So, obviously, starting out with the aces on the button, it's a great spot, and villain opens to 6 in front of him, pretty standard. Obviously, we get a 3-bet here. You never want to be calling here unless there's like some insane maniac in the blinds who's just 3-betting every single hand. So, that's obviously the first thing. Do you have any info on the villain here, for starters?
Yeah, he was a wreck. Have not too many sample size with him, but yeah, he was definitely a wreck. And like you mentioned, never ever ever consider flatting aces here. Besides, yeah, like you mentioned, a huge maniac in the blinds. But besides that, we always want to three bet cause yeah, we just get it in so often pre-flop, and he obviously calls with a bunch of worse. So yeah, always go ahead and three bet and never flat.
For sure, for sure. So he calls and pretty ugly board. Checks it over to you. Yeah, first decision. What do you think here?
Yeah, not the best flop for sure. I mean, we still have an overpair. That's good. But as we can see, the board is really connected. And of course, we always have to compare range against range. And on this board texture, Villain has also all the strong hands. Villain has pocket eights, pocket nines, pocket jacks. He's probably sometimes four betting, but I would think that most racks are going to call jacks the vast majority of the time to three bet and not go. That they will not four bet this hand quite frequently. He will have all the queen 10 suited. He will have all the 8-9 suited, maybe even Jack 9 suited. So as you can see, he has all the strong hands. So we have no nut advantage because we have aces. This is just not a thing on those board textures. And when he can have all the strong hands, a small sizing is actually what you should do on this board texture. So you should mix your strategy a little bit between bet small and check. Mm, And of course, we will also want to check some middling and strong hands, otherwise we're super capped on later streets. Yeah, Michael, what do you think about aces? Is this a candidate we could check on the flop from time to time, or is this just too strong in general?
No, I think it's definitely a hand you could check. Yeah, for sure. I mean, if it's like shallower, if the SPR is really low, I don't mind just like betting because then our hand could be like quote unquote nutted. But as you say, as it stands here, SPR is fairly deep. Like one pair of aces on this type of board is just not really that nutted of a hand. So we're not necessarily looking to pile money in against a reg, right? Like I think it's a really good idea to mix in checks, and this hand works perfectly as a check. Um, I think having the ace of clubs, I'm not sure if that would be a little bit nicer. Obviously, it'd be a bit nicer in the fact that it's like you're a bit less vulnerable, but I think it's not going to be a huge factor. So I think mixing in some checks with aces here is definitely a good idea. Also, some hands like Jack X, if you had a hand like Queen Jack suited, stuff like that, where you can check back and then hit straights or just call down on good runouts, right? But it's definitely not a spot where
Yeah.
you want to just overvalue your range and think like I just have to bet my entire range here because, as you said, thinking about ranges, this hits his range really hard. So definitely want to consider that.
Yeah, also when you think about it, right, when we bet big and we get raised, what you think we should do? This is just an
Yeah,
ugly spot in general, and that shows you that betting small and checking is quite a good strategy on a board texture like this. Villain has just the option to do way more mistakes when we bet small and check a lot.
yeah, for sure. And I think player type is really important here because I think if you're up against like a whale or a big fish, you could definitely just like blast here and just try to get the money in on the turn. Like you could even bet bigger than the size of the pot because you expect him to have like so many pair plus draw type hands, flush draws that he's never folding. So you could just bet like 50 and just hope the turn is like a six or lower or like a king or an ace or whatever, right? Or like a pair, right? There's going to be a decent amount of turns where you can just bet big on the flop and then just jam turn. But that's not really a strategy you want to be using against regs.
No, definitely not.
It's
But really good point. I think, yeah, like you mentioned, when his pre-flop range or his pre-flop call through range is so wide, and he's so loose on the flop that he's never folding like 8x or at least 9x and jack x and 10x and clubs, we should just blast flop and rip turn. Because on the turn we still get value from all his draws like 10x and all the flush draws. And of course, when the river bricks, you get nothing. So against a huge VIP, you definitely want to adjust in those situations.
so you do check back, which is totally fine. Very nice turn, and now he leads 30. So what do you think here? I think there's pretty much only one option. which I'm sure you agree with.
Yeah, he bets 3/4 pot. I think we can only call cause for a raise. Our hand is too weak. Like I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned before, he has all the nutted hands, so we just isolate ourselves against two pairs or sets. We don't want that. I mean, yes, from time to time he could call a worse hand like Ace Jack, but we block Ace Jack a ton because we have two aces in our hand. And besides that, like I mentioned, not too many worse hands that can call, but he has a ton of better hands that will call or even jam turn. So yeah, calling is our only option. And we also want to give him room to bluff when he has like King Queen or pocket sixes
Mm-hmm.
or king 10, whatever, right? We want to give him the option to bluff turn and bluff river. And of course, when we raise turn, he's folding all his bluffs. So that's also important on the turn that, yeah, we don't want to raise too thin for value. And again, because when we raise turn, we can just bet flop, right? This makes it easier. Mm, but
Yeah,
always think about how many worse hands can call. And I think aces is a perfect candidate to call turn against a big sizing.
yeah, for sure. Definitely agree with all those points. So standard call. River's pretty good card for us. I would say obviously it decreases the amount of boats he has. He shouldn't have like a ton of 8x. So yeah, it's definitely a pretty good river, and then we're just going to be seeing what he does. And I think here just calling's really standard. I mean, we're never going to fold, obviously. Raising's probably a bit too thin against a reg. I think if he's like a fish, you can definitely just raise for value here because it's only a min raise, right? You can just get it in. But I think against a reg, it's like going to be a little bit too thin. But obviously, yeah, never folding.
Yeah, I think when he's a fish, right, he also has like Jack 10 offsuit and Queen Jack offsuit and King Jack offsuit.
Yeah,
But
interesting.
Rex, I'm not calling like offsuit broadways to threebets out of position. So he
Yeah.
has way less combinations that he can call on the river that are worse. Also think he's quite often checking a middling Jack on
Mm-hmm.
the river.
Yeah.
So yeah, with aces again, not much to discuss. Too strong to fold. And yes, of course, we expect to lose against like 8, 9, and pocket eights, pocket nines, queen tens, queen ten, jacks quite often. But we still beat all his bluffs. So we still expect to see like a 10, like king 10 suited. We still expect to see clubs sometimes, and also a hand like king queen is not out of the question.
Yeah, for sure. So standard call, and he does have the ace jack of clubs. What do you think about his bet there on the river?
I think he did a good job. I think in his shoes, I would have played the hand exactly the same. I would have called a three bet. I mean, sometimes four betting is probably fine. Um, but yeah, we check flop. I would also bet turn big, get value from middling pairs, middling jacks, ace highs, and river. Same story. You should never be results orientated on those runouts, right? Because yeah, we have aces this time, but we would play the hand exactly the same with a hand like tens or queen jack or king jack. And even
Yeah,
with tens, I'm also hero calling on this run out. So
yeah,
I
for
think
sure.
he did a great job. And I think this is a great example where you should never be results orientated. And in this hand, it's just yeah a zero sum game, right? Because in villain's shoes we would have done the same. But it's important, I think, in villain's shoes that you go ahead and value bet and not always check call, because we don't have a ton of bluffs, right? We have a
Mm,
ton of middling type hands that we would check back on the river. So when you have ace jack, don't think your opponent has too many draws. Just go ahead and value bet and get called by all the worst hands. I think this is the perfect strategy on this run out.
yeah, for sure. I definitely agree because I think another thing to note too is that in these games, I think a lot of regulars and especially more of the weaker players, just like they're not going to check the flop with overpairs. Like once in a while they will do it, like aces
Good
and
point.
kings.
Yeah,
But a lot of people are just like they don't really think about having a checking range. They're not thinking about how does this board interact with his range and my range. So I'm going to check some hands. Like they're just going to bet really high majority of the time, and especially here because he blocks aces. I mean, it's not a huge factor, but it's like that's just like one additional thing to even think about is like he blocks one of your most likely checking hands that he loses to.
yeah,
So yeah, it's definitely a good spot to go ahead and bet here. And as you say, plenty of hands that we can look him up with because in our eyes he can have a lot of misdraws here, right? So even if we
yeah,
have a hand like ace king, I can see people making some loose calls in those spots. So I think it's
yeah.
well played
100%.
by both
Yeah,
for sure. So nice hand, and he scooped the pot, and yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed that, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, see ya. Bye.
Yeah.